Since since Professor Brzezinski said everything there was to be said, I just can't keep myself from telling you a joke that I've heard from a Russian politician, and that illustrates perfectly well, I believe, the first of Russia, the nostalgic Russia. And the joke is about these two hunters who were brought by a small plane somewhere into Siberia. And when the plane was leaving, he said, "Gentlemen, I'll come back in 2 days. But it's to pick you up. But it's a small plane, so no big animals, because it's a very small plane." And indeed, he came back after 2 days, and there they were, two hunters and an enormous bear. He said, "Gentlemen, I said no big animals." They said, yeah. We know we know from experience, if we give you $200, you will load the bear and take off with us. So indeed, the money changed hands. They loaded the bear onto the plane, and they joined. And they took off, and after about 5 miles, they collapsed. And one of the hunters wakes up and says, "What did happen?" The other says, "We crashed." Say, "Where?" About 2 miles from the place we crashed last year.
Should we finish on a joke, or is there any other last-minute question? Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Susan Cornwell with Reuters. Can you hear me? Yeah. I hope so. Can you hear me now? Yeah, I'm Susan Cornwell with Reuters. You were just saying you didn't think that Russia was really capable of threatening Central Europe in the near future, but we just heard from the Polish foreign minister he was rather concerned by this recent Russian military exercise near the borders of NATO, and he talked about how the Russians, I think he said they had 900 tanks, and there were just 6 American soldiers in Poland. And I wondered whether do you see a vacuum in Central Europe in terms of U.S. and NATO military installations? Do you think that it would be a good idea to put some U.S. or NATO more military installations there?
Well, I know about that exercise, the Zapad exercise, and I think it's provocative. It's also stupid. It's very reflective of Russia, number one, the nostalgic Russia, because what does it really accomplish for Russia? I mean, what does it accomplish for Russia? What it makes more likely, in fact, is something that presumably the people who sort of organize these maneuvers don't want to see, which is a gradual increase in NATO's capacities and presence in Central Europe. Because obviously its effect is to cause, very sensibly so, the authorities in Poland or in the Baltic republics to say, well, how about having now an exercise not called the West, but an exercise called the East? And I think there's going to be something like this, in fact, in the Baltic area. And there will probably be more emphasis in NATO on contingency planning, although some of it has taken place. But as a political judgment, as a historical judgment, I don't see those Russian forces that exercised in Belarus with the Belarusian army really sweeping westward in the foreseeable future. And by foreseeable future, I mean X number of years. So it's a kind of empty political gesture, which I think convinces me even more that a significant portion of the Russian political elite has lost touch with strategic reality, to the point that it's almost ridiculous. Take, for example, the great celebration in the Russian press, in particular the military press, of its most recent great military victory. Now, you would think that if they talked that way, they were talking about World War II. And they deserve it, because that was a great Russian-Soviet military victory. No, they're celebrating their victory over Georgian forces a year ago, which were two brigades trained by the United States for counterterrorism activity, and which somewhat unwisely were sent into Ossetia and then were overpowered by a Russian army of about 60,000 men that swept southward and into Georgia and, in fact, threatened Tbilisi, but which otherwise, from every study we have made of their military operation, performed surprisingly badly. It was an incompetent, messy, costly, disorganized victory, won largely by superiority in numbers, and perhaps not as quite a determined Georgian resistance as one would have wished for. But, that kind of reinforcement of foreign policy with military demonstrations is, if anything, counterproductive. I hate to think what might happen, for example, if the Russians, encouraged by this kind of stuff, started to try to intimidate Ukraine. They have begun to do some of that in Crimea. They're likely to produce a massive Ukrainian nationalist reaction. Because if there is anything the Ukrainians are united about, it's not the state, it's not common policy, it's land, it's territory. This really gets the Ukrainians going. I remind you of an incident several years ago called Tuzla. There was a little island in the Sea of Azov, which on the map was part of Ukraine, but close to it was Russian territory. So the Russians got the bright idea of sending out a lot of ships, construction ships, which started digging up stones and rocks to link the island to that territory, so that on the map it would then appear as Russia, which would give them a better access to the Sea of Azov. The Ukrainians became absolutely outraged. Kuchma, a relatively pro-Russian president, was in Brazil. He canceled his trip, flew to Ukraine, took a small plane to Tuzla, stood on the shores, and proclaimed that every Ukrainian is determined to protect Ukraine's sacred soil. At which moment, Ukrainian MiGs appeared and fired symbolically with machine guns into the sea. Kind of, a message to somebody, obviously. Then Ukrainian ships appeared. This is actually what I'm telling you is true, even though it sounds comical. Ukrainian ships appeared, pulled up to the side of the Russian ships, so as the Russian ships would dig up rocks and sand and dump it to connect Russia with this island, the Ukrainian ships would dig in, pick up the same rocks and sand, and throw it back into the sea. And this operation lasted a few hours until both sides came to their senses. In the meantime, the Ukrainian Rada held a special session. The Ukrainian Rada cannot legislate anything for weeks right now because they're so divided. They hold a special session, unanimous vote, everybody, the party of the regions, the Communist Party, and so forth, that the sacred soil of Ukraine must not be touched. Now, there could be something in Crimea, but even a year ago, when the Russians sent some of their Marines into Sevastopol on some sort of a task, which wasn't coordinated with the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian commanding officer in Simferopol, when there is an armored Ukrainian division stationed, phoned up the Russian naval commander and said, if your Marines are not back in your ship by 6 p.m. tonight, our tanks will be entering Sevastopol. And they were back on their ship by 6 p.m. So, the Russian military demonstrations are reminiscent of the past, and I can understand the Central Europeans remembering Budapest, remembering Prague, to be concerned. But I think we have to have a sense of how history has changed, how the strategic realities of Russia have changed.
Okay, very, very last question, Charles. I'll give to Charles, and please be brief.
Oh, I'll be very brief indeed. The response to the Russian military exercise, thanks to my BlackBerry here, is right here. The United States will hold first military exercises with Baltic states in 2010, either September or October or 2010. I don't know if this is in direct response, but you can make draw your own conclusion.
Well, even if they're not in direct response, they'll be seen as in direct response. And what benefit the Russians are getting out of that?
Okay, on that we will rest. Thank you very much, Zbig, and another round of applause.